Hey guys, it's Lady, and welcome back to this series of videos where I break down everything about our favorite Genshin characters. From stories unlocked via raising companionship levels, to voice lines said by other characters, to appearances in event quests, and so on. In other words, whether you don't have a specific character, can't be bothered to raise their companionship levels, need a refresher, or just want the basic TLDR of a character's text, then this ultimate lore guide is for you. Now, thanks to his rerun and center stage role in patch 2.3's main event, this video will focus on Mondstadt's alchemical genius, Albedo. So let's begin by going over the lore from his character stories that are unlocked via companionship leveling. I just think this info will provide better context to Albedo's actions during his actual appearances in-game, which we'll discuss later. So with that said, probably the most notable thing about Albedo is that he's an artificial life form. As in, rather than having been conceived and born directly from human parents, he was brought to life from chalk, which is the spotless soil and origins of primordial man, according to the master that created him. This master is the famed alchemist Rhine, a cold and strict woman who nonetheless raised Albedo and taught him the secrets of alchemy. Rhine first demonstrated her technique to him by materializing a huge life form burst from a culture tank into a shower of shattered fragments. A pretty familiar description, right? Based off this, we can see that Albedo's elemental burst takes inspiration from his master. Though this alchemy that they practice is actually an ancient creation art that not even the top scholars from Sumeru have much knowledge of. It's known as the art of chemia, which originated in Conria. You see, Conria was an underground realm with little natural fauna, so these people focused their alchemy on the creation of life. But like its birthplace, the art of chemia was lost to history, and prior to Albedo's arrival in Mondstadt, modern alchemy was not a very respected field in Teyvat. At most, it was only enough to put some broken odds and ends together, though everything changed when the Fire Nation when Albedo arrived with his massive corpus of alchemical wisdom. Which brings us to how and why Albedo ended up in Mondstadt in the first place. It turns out that his master is old friends with the famed travel writer Alice, who currently resided in the City of Freedom. Albedo was sent to her with a recommendation letter, and Alice, upon reading that Albedo would need a large laboratory, immediately recommended him to the Knights of Favonius. The Knights' work came quickly to an alchemical genius like him, so he was quickly made their chief alchemist and captain of the investigation team, though Albedo would be mistaken if he thought he'd have ample time to devote to his own experiments. You see, even though the Knights' work only took about 5% of his energy, Alice had entrusted him as essentially the big brother to her young daughter Klee. And as Albedo would soon discover, remedying this sweet girl's fiery disasters would end up taking most of his remaining energy. But though Klee and Alice have come to mean much to Albedo, his master is unquestionably the only person he views as true kin. Since his very birth, Albedo has been adventuring deep within domains with his master. He was content with his simple existence at that time. His purpose centered on accompanying Rhine executing her orders and meeting her expectations. But this all changed the day he and his master discovered an artifact known as the Heart of Naberius, deep in a dungeon. His teacher up and left without a word since then, and only left a single note, the recommendation letter, and a classical text, which turned out to be one of the last manuscripts of the Opus Magnum, which is likely a reference to the real-life alchemical process that attempted to create the Philosopher's Stone, known as the Magnum Opus. I'll go into a bit more detail about this and how it relates to Albedo later in the video, but back to his master's disappearance, she also left him with the title, the Cri de Prince, aka the Chalk Prince, as an acknowledgement that she had nothing further to teach him. As for what was written on that single note, it instructed Albedo to take the recommendation letter and find Alice in Mondstadt, in order to complete his final assignment. Now, Albedo has always thought that his past assignments were difficult, but he found that this last one was far too hard. He was to discover and show his master the true meaning of this world. And so, he often muses to himself to this day if it's fate that he'll never complete this and, thus, never see his master again. But speaking of Albedo and his relationships to others, while he may not appear in public often in Mondstadt, despite his important role in the Knights, this is not because he doesn't get along with other people. In fact, the public finds it a pleasant surprise that he doesn't have the eccentric and cold temperament that's normally seen among academics. Albedo is actually earnest in all his dealings and enjoys instructing his assistants, Sucrose and Timaeus, as well as giving his sketches to the citizens. You see, he actually developed this drawing habit of his while traveling with his master. He found that illustrating his notes and drawing the details of his subjects helped him understand their physical makeup better. Sketching also helped him enter a state of deep focus and clarity, where observing his alchemical work would become the only thing occupying his mind. And thus, Albedo was able to become a master artist without any formal training. He finds particular pleasure in capturing his subjects in their moments of joy, as he believes crystallizing such transient moments into a single sketch is something to be treasured. But while he's happy to give this art to the normally unsuspecting models, in the end, he finds it tiring to maintain relationships if they're established on excessive enthusiasm. Therefore, Albedo's view of friendship involves maintaining a certain degree of distance. But with his background covered, I think now's a good time to move on to Albedo's appearances in the actual game, which haven't involved any Archon quests so far. But not to worry, since he's been the star of his own story quest, of course, and the two main events of patch 1.2 and 2.3 respectively. So, starting with Act 1 of his story quest, the Traveler is making their first trek up to Dragonspine in search of Mondstadt's chief alchemist. When they finally spot Albedo, they see he's preoccupied with sketching the landscape, even though there's a group of hilichurls in the vicinity. So believing him to be in danger, the Traveler makes short work of them. Though, unfortunately, they actually had the wrong idea, since the hilichurls, not the scenery, were the main subject of Albedo's work. But he shifts gears upon learning that we're the honorary knight, and mentions that he's actually been looking forward to meeting us, since he's heard all about our extraordinary feats during the Storm Terror incident, and our unique command of the elements. And so, he hypothesizes that we must come from another world entirely. You see, he has a particular seed in his possession, one from another world as well, that he's had no luck in getting to sprout, so to speak. He's hoping that by observing us, a being from outside the world of Teyvat, he'll be able to find a breakthrough when it comes to nurturing this seed. Quite intrigued, the Traveler accepts and follows Albedo to the location of the first experiment. Here we are tasked with defeating a group of cryoslimes, and upon answering Albedo's questions, it's deemed that there's nothing unusual with the way we externally control the elements. In fact, the traveler appears quite normal to the average vision bearer in this regard. So the party continues onwards to Albedo's laboratory for the next part of the experiment. Here, Albedo has his assistant Timaeus help process the data, and also takes advantage of this opportunity to teach him about alchemy. But as for part 2 of the actual experiment, it involves mixing star silver ore into a concoction that will test how the traveler internally controls the elements. This is definitely a bit sketchy, even if Albedo assured us ahead of time that he has contingency plans in place, just in case of any adverse reaction. Though thankfully for the traveler, the potion reacts perfectly in line with Albedo's expectations. Rather amazingly, the Critoponce tested his own sketchy potion on himself first. Now, the next experiment focuses on finding if the traveler wields any otherworldly powers that have never been demonstrated before in all of Teyvat. And after running through the set of challenges, Albedo confirms that while the traveler is unordinarily gifted, there's nothing wholly beyond this world when it comes to their abilities. So at last, they move on to the final experiment. A standard physical and intellectual challenge to measure the traveler's capabilities. Albedo has gone on ahead to prepare the final result of all the experiments combined when Rosaria approaches the traveler once more. Ever suspicious of Albedo, she's never stopped observing us from the shadows during this entire day. She admonishes us for falling for Albedo's friendly personality, and hopes we won't make the same mistake next time. After that, she takes her leave. Now back at the lab, Albedo has drawn the conclusion that the traveler is perfectly normal. By that he means biologically speaking, according to Teyvat standards. But in reality, the journey with the traveler today helped Albedo discover that breakthrough he needed to foster that otherworldly seed's growth. And with that, we see a blossom take shape, bloom, then fade out of existence all in one brief moment. Albedo says that this transient bloom serves as an analogy for the small miracle it was that he and the traveler were able to meet this very day. Just because the moment was short in the grand scheme of things doesn't make it any less valuable or precious. In fact, Albedo is beyond grateful for the day's experience with the traveler and looks forward to the next time they meet. Though once they've left, Albedo can be seen glancing at the vial used by the traveler earlier today, wondering what the sediment at the bottom, which shouldn't be there, could possibly mean. He muses about how both he and the traveler are so alike, that they are both composed of a substance that has yet to be fully defined, and rather ominously, he hopes that we'd be able to put a stop to him if someday he were to end up destroying all of Mondstadt. Now moving on to patch 1.2's Festering Desire event, we come across Sucrose, Albedo's assistant, who's at a loss of what to do. She feels like he's hiding something from her and Timaeus, and it's got her itching with curiosity, so she requests that we try probing into the secret. Upon finding Albedo in his lab, he greets us with a mysteriously eerie purple sword. Apparently the knights apprehended some treasure hoarders a while ago and found the sword amongst their goods. It was assumed to be stolen plunder, but no one's come to claim it, so it's just been sitting in the knight's storehouse until Albedo came across it. He postulates that only we can wield it, since the sword is cursed with Durin's power. Durin was a black dragon who once terrorized Mondstadt, though thanks to the combined efforts of Dvalin and the animo god Barbados, he was defeated in these freezing mountains that, as a result, came to be known as Dragonspine. The never-melting snow here seals the corrosive toxin of Durin's body, though it appears that a blacksmith at an unknown point in time had once ground Durin's eyes, claws, and scales into a powder, which he then used to coat the sword. Unfortunately, ordinary mortals can't withstand this kind of power though, so the blacksmith must have gone mad from the corrosion that seeped into his body from the sword's hilt. But since the traveler was able to purify Dvalin's tears, that same ability has managed to protect them from Durin's toxins as well. As the sword begins to glow, Albedo voices his theory that it's able to absorb energy from defeated enemies, so he asks the traveler to continue using it in battle to stimulate its growth. Continuing to use the sword on the mountain draws the attention of powerful foes, like particularly fierce hilichurls and the Fatui. At one point during our adventure, Albedo's sketchbook is stolen by the hilichurls, so he and the traveler go on quite the journey around the mountain in order to recover it. This leads us to a rather touching moment, since even after we're fortunately able to retrieve the sketchbook, Albedo nonchalantly mentions that he could have just redrawn the pictures and notes if our attempts were unsuccessful. But he begins to see how his sketchbook is more important to him than he realized when the traveler and Paimon bring up how much work he must have put into it after carrying it around all this time. As for the sword though, the traveler's abilities are slowly able to purify it, resulting in all the benefits of the absorbed power minus Durin's curse. A week later, for reasons that take too long to get into, reckless pallid's reckless actions causes some of the energy in the festering desire to leak into the dead withered roots of a cryo-regisvine, bringing it back to life. Albedo, Sucrose, and the Traveler team up to defeat it, with the two alchemists finding it fascinating that this revival could occur in the first place. In the end, Albedo extracts the accumulated life essence that the blade has absorbed for further research purposes, but otherwise leaves the actual sword with the Traveler as a memento. But like the ending to his story quest, Patch 1.2's event ends rather ominously, with Albedo ruminating over his master, Durin, and if him meeting the Traveler really was a good thing. Now buckle in, cause Patch 2.3's event quest is a long but important one, since it introduces the imposter Albedo plot. So in Mondstadt, Traveler just barely misses Albedo leaving the alchemy table, and he appears to be in an off mood, though his assistants haven't noticed anything strange. Anyway, we meet Albedo shortly after on Dragonspine, where it seems like the Traveler and Paimon were mistaken about his mood earlier, since he seems just like his normal self now. They all head to his lab together, but are shocked to see it in such a sorry state, and Albedo's concern only deepens when he discovers that his alchemy notes have gone missing. We find footprints just outside the camp and track them to a cave nearby. Albedo knows that this cave has only one other exit and plans to cut the thief off there, while the Traveler stays put to guard this entrance in case the thief decides to loop back around. But Paimon gets bored while waiting, so we collect some star silver nearby for paint supplies. Long story short, Albedo agreed to give us painting lessons earlier, which explains Traveler and Paimon's artsy mood. Albedo makes it back not long after, but unfortunately by himself. Apparently, the thief was too quick and got away, so before we resume the chase, Paimon asks if we should separate the good bits of star silver from the bad bits first, just so we won't have to lug around any unnecessary ore. Albedo oddly fixates on Paimon's words and mentions how humans only want things that are good, so once they've learned to distinguish between the good and the bad, they'll always choose to dispose of that which is useless. But that thought is cut short by nearby cries for help, so we rush over to bonk some Fatui and free bad luck Bennett, though actually it doesn't seem like Albedo followed us, nor is he at our last location either. And so this is when things really start to get odd. Albedo approaches from the direction of the cave, wondering where we've been since we were supposed to be guarding the entrance. And as if we needed any more confusion, Eula hurries over, accusing Albedo of leading the child Joel towards the dangerous outskirts of Durin's remains. And not only that, but he had the audacity to attack her when she tried to stop him. Though shocked at first, Albedo pieces together that Eula must have met an imposter, who's likely also the thief. And since the traveler is able to corroborate that the notes are missing, Eula decides to trust Albedo's word for now. Then privately later, with only the traveler, Albedo reveals the secret of his synthetic origins, that he and Durin are the two miraculous life forms created by Gold, an alchemist from Conria. Meanwhile, we tell him about our encounter with the imposter back at the cave, and learning of this, he begins to suggest we head back to Mondstadt, since he doesn't want to cause any more trouble by getting us wrapped up in this cursed tale. But he should have known that, as the traveler, we don't ditch our friends. Duh. So we continue to help him investigate the situation. Now, days later, they discover that the other three still haven't made it back down the mountain, courtesy of Bennett's bad luck. So Albedo offers them some respite at his camp, as they all must be exhausted. We do get to see his amazing alchemy in action as a plus, seeing him produce chairs for everyone via merely painting. Then the group has a nice cozy dinner together around the campfire. Once Bennett falls asleep after eating and Amber and Eula head off on their own for a bit, Albedo and Traveler get the perfect opportunity to paint. Paimon ends up getting an amazing portrait out of it, courtesy of Albedo, who reflects on how refreshing it was to have had all this liveliness at his camp today. Now the next morning, we're all just beginning to leave camp when an avalanche begins descending. Albedo surprisingly goes after the falling Bennett, while the rest happen to avoid getting swept off the cliff. And once the avalanche has passed, they quickly head down and find Bennett, though it takes ages to find Albedo, who's oddly ended up far from most of the debris. Since everyone must be exhausted after all this, he suggests that they take the shortcut down the rest of the mountain, even if the path is a little more difficult to make out. And it's here where Albedo launches his surprise attack against the others, but is thwarted by the traveler, and ultimately his real counterpart. Fake Albedo then transforms into a mutated whopper flower, which the entire group makes short work of together. Now, how was it that the traveler could tell the imposter from the real Albedo? Well, it turns out the imposter had no star-shaped mark like real Albedo has on his neck. Later in private, Albedo explains the origins and meaning of his birthmark, so to speak. Unlike real life, where energy flows from inwards to outwards, for example, a flower blooming to life, artificial life is created when energy from an external source is directed inwards. The result is like in glass blowing, where a mark is left at the site where the infusion is sealed off. The only mark in an otherwise perfect piece of art. He suspects the imposter's failure to replicate the mark was actually deliberate, since it probably viewed it as a sign of imperfection. Now once the traveler leaves, Albedo is seen heading off on his own with his sword drawn, supposedly to confront the real imposter and actual thief of his notes who's still out there. A few days later, Albedo explains the truth of everything that went down the past couple days via the guise of a story. And since I'm trying my very best to focus this video only on Albedo, I'll be working on a separate summary/explanation video about the whole connected story of subjects 1, v2.3, and the gardener, as well as speculation about it at another time. So that brings us to the final part of this event in Mondstadt. While it appears like we're speaking with the real Albedo at the start of this conversation, the star mark disappears while we're still talking with him. He covers his neck with his hand for a little bit, but after removing it, the mark is back, meaning we're actually speaking with Subject 2, aka the imposter. And so, the traveler is left with fake Albedo's smug and also eerie gardening analogy about growing orchards on Dragonspine, considering he did create that other clone from a whopper flower. Now, these weren't the only event patches that Albedo played a role in, so let's go over the two others, starting with patch 1.4's Windbloom Festival. He's able to decipher an ancient alchemy recipe Sucrose found, and once we collect the ingredients and he takes them through the alchemical process, the finished creation appears as a massive blue sweet flower, a result Albedo finds only fitting for his bespectacled assistant. Mondstadt's chief alchemist was also present in patch 1.6's Midsummer Island adventure. Like Kaya, Diluc, and Razor, Albedo was led to this archipelago after having received a personalized letter from this supposed Dodo King. In his case, this mystery figure claimed to have kidnapped Klee, which was all he needed to drop everything. Albedo's presence among the group is a big help thanks to his observations, and plus he's a very appreciated voice of encouragement for Klee when she gets to the final stage of the mystery. Though her worries at this stage were for naught when the entire island getaway is unveiled to have just been a gift prepared by her mother. Albedo seemed to be the only one who already had it figured out, and so he appears bemused rather than surprised at the big reveal, probably all because he was so used to Aunt Alice's antics at that point already. In the end, he's glad that the islands were the perfect idea of summer fun for Klee and the traveler. Speaking of Albedo's relationship with Klee, the latter mentions how they both have established a secret code together. So whenever her older bro has a sign reading "Experiment in progress" on his door, that means "come back later." Klee doesn't mind waiting though, since Albedo's already really patient with her, and he views her as a younger sister after all. Now, Mona visits the two sometimes for a couple of reasons. One is for the free meal, and two is to exchange valuable pointers with Albedo since they're both accomplished students of famed masters. The astrologist also rather envies Albedo's ability to focus solely on his research without getting bogged down by worldly affairs. Albedo's fellow knights all have something to say about him too. Like, his assistant Sucrose really admires his talented way of thinking, which allows him to always get to the bottom of a task and explain the methodology afterward. Honestly, she kinda has a tendency of placing him on a pedestal. Like, Albedo wishes she would just address him less formally, considering they're of a similar age. But if you believe Sucrose avoids his field of alchemy because of her slight inferiority complex, think again. She really does just have way more of an interest in another line of research than his. But seeing how Albedo's research can get pretty intense, one time Sucrose was on the brink of collapse after an experiment lasted for 5 days straight. So when Albedo finally realized, he did what everyone hopes their boss would do, and organized a mandatory 7-day vacation for his assistant. As for the other knights, Outrider Amber thinks it's pretty cool how he's always tinkering with this awesome stuff in his workshop, though she can never tell what he's thinking. Jean only has the highest respect for him, believing terms like genius were created specifically for people like Albedo, while the chief alchemist himself could argue that Jean is more reliable than actual Grandmaster Varka. Lisa is always impressed with his solutions and talents, and thinks his pretty face certainly doesn't hurt. Albedo finds Lisa's academic perspectives always valuable on his end, but truly thinks it's a shame that someone of her talents has chosen to remain a mere librarian. Now, poor Kaya gets the short end of the stick though, since he describes Albedo as calm, collected, incredibly talented, and even implies that he's kinda into him. Meanwhile, Albedo throws the cavalry captain so much shade, cause for all the time he spends sketching the citizens of Mondstadt in detail, he only spends 3 strokes on Kaya. 1 for the face, 1 for the eye patch string, and 1 for the eye patch. And though not a knight like most in Mondstadt, Diona has heard great things about the alchemy genius and wonders if he could help her in finally mixing a drink people wouldn't like. But then there are those who have reservations about Albedo, like Rosaria for example. Yet even she can't help but find him rather intriguing, since she does like people with stories. As for our Animo Archon in disguise, Venti knows all about Albedo's true artificial origins, and can't help but wonder what would happen if someone lost control of that ancient art in Mondstadt. Though our favorite bard ultimately brushes off those worries as the citizen's problem, not his. Now lastly, Xinqiu is the only playable character who's not from Mondstadt that Albedo has something to say about. Which brings us to our final section of this video, with that being all the miscellaneous things about the good alchemist boy. So back to how he knows Xinqiu, he's actually the illustrator for the Liyue Swordsman's book series, A Legend of Sword. Unfortunately for Xinqiu though, the actual story has received only middling reviews. Meanwhile, Albedo's illustrations continue to receive high praise. Yae Publishing House actually tried to get him to work with more popular authors, but Albedo was offended that they thought he could be swayed with money. Plus, he actually likes Xinqiu's written works anyway, so nice try, YPH. But speaking of his art, one time he had the opportunity to sketch Barbara, and hey, wouldn't you know, Albert offered to purchase it. But Albedo says no to simps, sorry child, and decided to give the portrait to Jean instead. Albedo is also quite particular when it comes to his food preferences. You see, because he has a relatively small appetite, he's not very fond of huge portions offered at restaurants. If he eats too little, the meal is wasted, but if he overeats, the joy of the taste is lost. So, what was his genius solution, you ask? Just avoid restaurants entirely! But to contrast, he very much has a sweet tooth, seeing as desserts are his favorite. But speaking of foods, did you know Albedo has quite the taste for spiders? Or well, a certain kind of spider at the very least. The ones living along the roots of ancient trees apparently boast quite a fragrant flavor when smoked with Cape jasmine, lemongrass, and cardamom. Since this came up during a talk about his first-hand knowledge of ancient trees, it makes me wonder if he first learned about this from his master. Anyway, to wrap up his current lore, Albedo may appear as just the typical genius type on the surface, when in reality, he has many layers to his character. As for the path he's currently treading, well, you see, Albedo hardly gave his vision a single glance when it first appeared, and saw it merely as a tool to help him along in his research to, one day, understand the truth of their world, visions being no exception, of course. And given that this is essentially the final task he received from Rhindaughter, what will happen if and or when creation and master reunite? Though is Albedo even still around in the first place? Cause patch 2.3's final scenes left so many questions that has me eagerly waiting for more. And so, this was a super long video. but the good alchemist boy deserved it. Let me know if you learned anything new or think I missed something when it comes to Albedo, and all update videos I do for him will be linked in the pinned comment below, by the way. Also, please like this video if you liked it, and subscribe for more of this series. I'm still working on that Eula one that hopefully is coming out soon. And also, hey, just letting you know you can join our welcoming and friendly Discord community. And if you happen to like the Trails and or Persona series, I have a whole separate channel dedicated to those games, so check that out if you wish. But otherwise, thanks so much for watching, guys, and until next time, take care. See ya!